A virgin was forced into a marriage for 10 coins, until an Apache stepped forward to take the blame. The noon sun burned over Dry Creek, as if it wanted every shameful detail visible when they dragged Marin toward the church steps, the air thick with dust and gossip, while her trembling hands clutched the edge of her faded shawl, trying to hide the fear crawling up her throat as the men behind her rattled a small leather pouch that clinked with exactly 10 coins. The price they'd agreed upon, the price her uncle accepted without meeting her eyes, the price that told the whole town she wasn't being married. She was being traded. The groom, Harlan Pike, stood proud beside the preacher, a man twice Marin's age whose smile was as sharp as a brand-new knife, his chest puffed with the cruel satisfaction of someone who believed 10 coins bought him a gentle wife and a lifetime of control. She tried to keep her eyes on the ground, on the cracks in the steps, on anything that wasn't his smirk, but the whispering crowd forced her head lower with every breath, making her feel smaller, cheaper, weightless in the worst way, like a thing being handed off with no say at all. The friction tightened when Harlan grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward, showing her off to the watching faces like he'd just purchased livestock, and she stumbled, nearly falling, her shawl slipping to reveal the bruise he'd given her the night before, when she dared to ask for one more day to think. A few women gasped softly, but no one stepped forward. No one protested. No one wanted to challenge the man who owned half the town's grain storage. That was when the dust at the far end of the street shifted. A lone Apache warrior walked into view, his steps steady, his braids tied with dark cloth, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at Harlan, didn't even look at the preacher. His gaze went straight to Marin, as if he had been following the tremor of her fear from miles away. The gesture was small but powerful. He slowed his pace as he neared the church steps, placing himself at an angle where sunlight cast his shadow over her, a protective silhouette that made her breath catch in her chest. He didn't touch her or speak, but Harlan stiffened at the mere presence of someone who wasn't intimidated by his coins, his size, or his authority. Fade settled around the tense square as the Apache stopped just close enough to make every whisper die, his stillness asking the question no one else dared. Why is a woman being sold in daylight? And Marin, swallowing hard beneath the weight of expectations she had no strength left to fight, felt, for the first time in weeks, a single fragile thread of hope tug against the ropes binding her fate. Harlan's grip tightened on Marin's wrist the moment the Apache stopped near the steps, his fingers digging hard enough to leave new marks as he snarled under his breath. "Keep your eyes down, girl," trying to drag her closer to the preacher, as if speeding the ceremony would erase the presence of the man whose silent arrival had cracked the ceremony's brittle confidence. But Marin couldn't help glancing sideways at the warrior, at the way he stood completely still, shoulders relaxed, gaze fixed on her with a calm that didn't challenge Harlan, didn't provoke violence, didn't attempt ownership, only acknowledged her fear in a way no one else had. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers flickering like sparks through dry grass as people wondered why an Apache would walk straight into a forced marriage transaction without hesitation, and whether he was just passing through or had stopped because the injustice was too loud to ignore. Harlan puffed up, trying to reclaim control, barking loud enough for everyone to hear, "Wedding's private, move along." But his voice cracked on the last word, the sound skidding awkwardly across the street because the Apache didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His steady presence undermining Harlan's authority more effectively than a dozen armed men ever could. The friction thickened when Harlan tugged Marin again, forcing her to stumble up the first step, and the Apache shifted 1 foot forward, not blocking, not interfering, but placing himself where Harlan would have to shove past him to drag her higher. A few townsfolk stiffened at the shift, sensing danger, but the warrior's hands stayed low, empty, peaceful. His posture clear. If harm is done, it will not pass unnoticed. Marin's breath hitched as Harlan hissed, "You're embarrassing me." But the Apache turned just slightly, enough to let her see his face more clearly, the quiet strength in his jaw, the certainty in his stance, the profound steadiness of someone who had already chosen not to let her vanish behind a man like Harlan without a witness. Fade slipped through the tense air as the preacher hesitated over his book, unsure whether to begin, while Marin, shaking, half-dragged, half-standing, felt something shift inside her chest. Something small but stubborn, a spark of resistance rising at the sight of a man who didn't know her name but couldn't walk past her suffering. And for the first time, she wondered if she wasn't as powerless as she'd been told. The sun beat down on the church porch like it wanted the truth exposed, every beam of light catching the small leather pouch of coins. Harlan shook with smug impatience, the 10 dull clinks echoing across the street as he barked at the preacher, "Get on with it! I paid fair!" As if fairness could be measured in a handful of money exchanged for a terrified woman's future. Marin kept her eyes lowered, but her breath trembled visibly, her pulse fluttering so hard at her throat she thought the whole town could see it. And the crowd, those who came to watch a scandal, those who came because silence was easier, began to shift uneasily, sensing something was off, something uglier than the usual dry creek gossip. The Apache didn't move from where he stood, his presence carving a silent line across the ceremony. His shadow still stretching toward her like a quiet anchor, and when Harlan saw the warrior's eyes flick briefly to the bruises on Marin's wrist, he jerked her closer as if to hide the proof of what he'd already done, snarling, "Don't you look at him!" But the Apache wasn't looking at Harlan. He was studying the coins, the pathetic little sum rattling around in that pouch. And then he looked slowly around the square, at every face pretending 10 coins was a normal price for a woman's life, and the weight of his silent judgment felt heavier than any shouted accusation. The friction sharpened when Harlan lifted Marin's chin roughly, forcing her to face the preacher, muttering loud enough for all to hear, "It's legal, she's untouched, and her uncle said yes, that's all that matters." A hush fell. Legal. Untouched. Sold for 10 coins. Words meant to justify humiliation, not truth. The Apache finally shifted his stance, one small step forward, boots scraping lightly against the dust, not threatening, not aggressive, just impossible to ignore. Every watching eye snapped to him. Harlan stiffened. The preacher hesitated, book half open, uncertain whether to speak the vows or close it entirely. And Marin, pinned between fear and disbelief, felt her lungs seize when the Apache let his gaze settle on her, with a steadiness that said he understood exactly what Harlan meant by untouched, understood the shame laced inside the transaction, understood the danger that awaited her after the ceremony. And he did not intend to let that danger proceed, unchallenged. Fade rolled in as a breeze cut through the square, lifting the dust, carrying a murmur between the townsfolk as the warrior's expression tightened. Not with anger, not with threat, but with a quiet knowing that turned the entire exchange into something deeply wrong, something much larger than a marriage, something he wasn't prepared to walk away from. Not while she stood trembling in a stranger's grip, traded like a thing instead of a life. Marin tried to keep her breath steady as Harlan shoved her another inch towards the preacher, the roughness in his grip scraping over the bruise on her wrist until stars pricked behind her eyes. But she swallowed the sound that tried to escape, because the whole town was watching, waiting, pretending this exchange was just another frontier practicality instead of a humiliation wrapped in 10 clinking coins. The preacher lifted his book again, hands trembling slightly, and murmured, "We'll begin." But even his voice carried the unease of a man who knew something wasn't right. And as the words formed on his lips, Marin felt the world tilt, her knees softening under the pressure of being pushed into a vow she never chose. The Apache's gaze followed the slight sway of her body, catching the way she fought not to collapse. And his shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, as if rooting himself deeper into the dust so she'd have something steady in her line of sight. Harlan noticed the glance and hissed through his teeth, "Ignore him, he's nothing," jerking Marin's arm hard enough to force her head up. The friction snapped when the sharp motion made her gasp, and the sound wasn't the quiet, controlled breath she'd tried to swallow, but a raw, involuntary cry that cracked the thin layer of silence everyone was hiding behind. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Hollis, who ran the bakery, stepped back as if realizing she'd been complicit just by watching. The preacher's voice faltered mid-word. And before Marin could stop herself, before shame could clamp her throat shut again, the truth tumbled out in a small, shaking voice. "He hurt me last night, before paying a single coin." The words struck Harlan like a slap, shock flickering before rage surged into his face, and he barked, "Liar!" loud enough to shake dust from the porch beams, but his fury only made the crowd recoil farther, their eyes darting from Marin's bruised wrist to the way she flinched under his grip. The Apache stepped forward, not to confront, not to seize, but to stand where everyone could see her clearly, where no one could pretend they hadn't heard what she said. His posture didn't threaten, but it didn't yield either, and the sunlight catching on his braids made him look like a man carved from resolve itself. Harlan spat at the ground, trying to regroup, growling, "She's saying it to ruin the ceremony." But his voice trembled ever so slightly, not with guilt, but with the fear of a secret dragged into daylight. Fade washed across the steps as Marin lowered her gaze, trembling from the shock of having finally spoken aloud the thing she'd been too frightened to tell even her own uncle, and the Apache's steady presence beside her told the whole town without a single word. The truth wasn't going back into the shadows now. Not as long as he was standing in the light beside her. The square seemed to shrink after Marin's trembling confession, the space between every heartbeat tightening as the town absorbed her words, the bruise on her wrist, the fear in her posture, and the ugly truth they had all politely ignored until now. Harlan's face flushed a dark, furious red as he whipped toward the preacher, barking, "Say it's a lie! Tell them she's hysterical!" But the preacher only pressed his lips together, lowering his book as though its pages had suddenly become too heavy to hold, and that hesitation, small as it was, made Harlan's rage flare even hotter. He jabbed a finger toward Marin, shouting, "She's mine by agreement! 10 coins! The deal stands!" and dragged her forward so roughly her feet scraped against the step, her shoulder pitching awkwardly as she tried not to fall. The friction peaked when she stumbled hard, her hand flying out to catch herself, but instead of meeting the cold wood of the porch rail, her palm brushed the Apache's arm. Just a graze, just a tremble of contact, and he reacted instantly, stepping between her and Harlan with a movement so fluid and calm it made the entire square hold its breath. He didn't touch Harlan. He didn't raise his fists. He simply placed his own body in the space Marin had been forced into, straightening to his full height, with the quiet authority of someone who had no interest in fighting, but every interest in stopping harm. Harlan recoiled, startled more by the stillness than the step itself, as though the warrior's calm carved a line in the dust that even his anger couldn't cross. Murmurs rippled outward from the crowd, a few townsfolk shifting uncomfortably, others staring at Marin's trembling form with something close to guilt, finally seeing what she looked like when she wasn't trying to stand perfectly still for fear of punishment. The Apache reached down, not toward Harlan, not toward any weapon, but toward Marin's fallen shawl, lifting it gently from the dirt and shaking off the dust with slow, deliberate motions before draping it carefully around her shoulders, his hands never touching her skin, his eyes never asking anything in return. The gesture felt like a declaration, a quiet promise that she would not be dragged bare into a life she didn't choose, and several women in the crowd covered their mouths at the sight, recognizing the dignity in the act for what it was. Harlan stepped forward again, sputtering, "You don't get to interfere. You think this is your business?" But the Apache didn't turn his head. He simply angled his body enough that Marin remained shielded, his calm so unshakable it made Harlan's fury look small, desperate, childish. Fade settled over the tense moment as Marin clutched the shawl tighter, feeling, for the first time since the wedding had been announced, the faint outline of safety forming around her, not because someone claimed her, not because someone fought for her, but because a man who owed her nothing chose to stand still and refused to let cruelty continue unchecked. The shawl settled around Marin's shoulders like a fragile piece of armor, its weight small but its meaning enormous, and the Apache's quiet act struck the crowd harder than any fistfight could have. This wasn't possession, wasn't romance, wasn't a challenge. It was a stranger refusing to let a woman stand in humiliation. The town sensed it, even if they couldn't name it. Harlan sensed it most of all. His jaw tightened, his boots scraping angrily against the porch as he stepped forward, spitting. "You think she's pure? You think she's innocent?" His voice rose to a shrill pitch he'd never used in public before, cracking as if he could feel his grip on the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. "She's lying to ruin me!" The townspeople stiffened. The blacksmith crossed his arms. Mrs. Hollis shook her head slowly. Regret etched across her face, and the preacher, hands trembling, closed his book all the way. That tiny motion, the soft thud of the leather cover, made Harlan spin toward him in fury, but before he could unleash another shout, the Apache took a single step forward. Not a threatening one, not aggressive, but firm enough that Harlan stopped mid-breath, as though his rage had collided with something solid. The warrior didn't speak, didn't lift his hands, didn't even look directly at Harlan. He simply existed in a way that made every lie Harlan tried to shout feel thinner, weaker, more transparent. The friction twisted sharply when a quiet voice rose from the back of the crowd, a ranch hand who had fetched Marin's uncle the night Harlan visited. "I heard her crying through the wall," he murmured. "He wasn't supposed to touch her before the vows." The words floated through the square like smoke, impossible to recapture once released. Harlan whipped around, red-faced, snarling, "She told you that? She made you believe—" "I didn't need her to tell me," the man said, eyes down but voice carrying. A hush fell so deep it felt like the dirt itself listened. The Apache shifted slightly, enough that Marin could lean against the porch rail behind him, her trembling easing as she watched the town start to unwrap its own blindness. Harlan's fury began to crumble under the weight of too many eyes, too much evidence, too many quiet truths surfacing from corners where silence had once lived comfortably. Desperate now, he jabbed a shaking finger at Marin and barked, "She was promised! She was paid for! I have the right—" And then he choked off, because the Apache finally turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and met Harlan's eyes with a silence so heavy it crushed the last shreds of the man's authority. Not violent, not threatening, just the calm certainty of someone who had already decided. This ends here. Fade swept over the scene as Harlan stumbled back a step, the strength in his posture sagging, the coins in his pouch suddenly sounding cheap and shameful, while Marin clutched her shawl tighter, realizing the warrior's silence had done what no one else had dared, make the whole town confront the truth she'd been punished for even whispering. The air in Dry Creek thickened as Harlan staggered back a step, his boots scuffing against the porch like he suddenly couldn't remember how to stand on ground that had always bent for him, his face blotchy with the realization that the crowd wasn't looking away anymore. People who once whispered excuses for his temper now stared openly at the bruise on Marin's wrist, the trembling in her fingers, the Apache standing as still as a carved post between them. And that shift, small, quiet, collective, made Harlan's authority feel as flimsy as paper left in the rain. He tried to recover his footing, barking, "You all think you know something? You don't know anything." But the sound cracked, wobbling in the dry air, and when he reached out to grab Marin again, the crowd itself recoiled. A subtle ripple of movement that told him plainly they weren't going to smooth this over for him anymore. The Apache didn't move at first, letting the silence weigh heavier and heavier, then stepped forward with a controlled calm that made the entire street stop breathing, placing himself fully between Marin and the man who'd bought her for 10 coins, his shoulders squared but not aggressive, his hands lowered but ready not to fight, but to deny harm the space it needed to grow. That small shift enraged Harlan, who swung his hand in a sloppy, desperate motion meant more to reassert dominance than to land a blow. But before it reached anything but empty air, 2 townsmen, once his drinking companions, now looking sick with regret, grabbed him by the elbows and held him back, their voices tight as they muttered, "Enough, Harlan. We saw what we saw." The friction climbed as Harlan thrashed against their hold, shouting, "She belongs to me! Her uncle agreed! You all heard!" Only to choke when Marin finally stepped out from behind the Apache. Not close, not brave, but visible, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders as she said in a voice that shook but didn't break, "I never agreed. I never said yes. Not once." The words echoed more loudly than any scream could have, and the preacher who had been silent at the steps lifted his book again. Not to read from it, but to close it firmly against his chest and say, "A marriage cannot begin on force. Not in my church." Harlan yanked against the men holding him, but no one moved to help him. No one looked sympathetic. No one stepped forward to soften his humiliation. The Apache's gesture was small, yet impossible to ignore. He angled his body slightly, giving Marin room to stand without being overshadowed, as if returning her voice had been his goal all along. Fade rolled through the square as Harlan was dragged down the steps, his protests turning into shrill, useless sound, while Marin, shaking but upright, realized she was no longer the girl being traded for 10 coins, and that the stranger standing near her had not come to rescue her, but to make sure the truth had a place to stand. Dust swirled around Harlan's boots as the 2 men dragged him off the church porch, his shouts echoing down the street in a high, frantic pitch that sounded less like a wronged groom and more like a cornered animal. But the crowd, once so eager for gossip, stood frozen, finally seeing the ugliness they had ignored for too long. Marin clutched her shawl with trembling fingers, her breath quick and shallow. But she didn't hide behind the Apache this time, didn't shrink into the space behind him, instead standing in clear view as if the sunlight itself insisted she stop disappearing for other people's comfort. The sheriff arrived from the far end of town, boots heavy, expression tight as he surveyed the scene, and Harlan lunged at him immediately, sputtering, "Arrest her! Arrest him! The savage assaulted our wedding!" But the sheriff didn't even reach for his cuffs. He was too busy staring at the bruise on Marin's wrist, the split in her lower lip, the raw fear lingering in her eyes. "Is that true, miss?" he asked gently, and though Marin's throat tightened, she nodded once, small but certain, whispering, "He came to my uncle's house last night. I didn't want him there." It was the kind of truth that could unravel a man in public, and it did. Harlan lunged again, wild with panic, but half the crowd surged forward to stop him this time. 2 ranch hands, a blacksmith, the baker's husband, and even Mr. Alder from the post office, forming a wall that Harlan bounced off like a man suddenly realizing that the town he thought he owned now wanted nothing to do with him. The Apache stepped aside just enough that Marin wasn't behind him, but beside him, his presence still steady but now more like an anchor than a shelter. He didn't raise a hand, didn't issue a warning, didn't speak a single word, yet somehow every man between him and Harlan stood taller, braver, as if his calm had seeped into them. The friction tightened again when Harlan shrieked, "You'll regret this, all of you! She was bought. She owed me. 10 coins buys." But the sheriff cut him off sharply, voice cold enough to chill the sun. 10 coins don't buy a woman's body, or her silence. You know better. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the sheriff stepped forward, gripping Harlan by the collar with a firm, practiced hand. "You're coming with me," he said. And suddenly the scene shifted. Not a wedding anymore, not a negotiation, but a reckoning. A public one. Harlan thrashed uselessly as he was dragged toward the jailhouse, his boots carving frantic lines in the dirt, and the crowd parted without sympathy, without hesitation, without the faintest desire to save him. Fade swept in as Marin watched him disappear down the street, her breath collapsing in a soft, trembling exhale. And for the first time, she let herself lean, not fully, not heavily, but enough, toward the Apache's quiet presence, knowing deep in her bones that she was finally free of the man who had tried to turn her life into a transaction of 10 coins and stolen choices. The sheriff's hands stayed firm on Harlan's collar as the angry, flailing man was dragged down the dusty main road, his shouts dissolving into the hot morning air like lies losing their last grip on the world. The crowd followed at a distance, not out of curiosity but out of something like penance, as if they needed to witness the fall of the man they'd silently enabled, and Marin walked with them, one step behind the Apache whose steady presence kept the space around her calm, even as her body trembled from the shock of freedom coming so suddenly it left her knees weak. She expected Harlan to keep screaming, expected him to blame her, expected the town to look at her with shame or sympathy or misunderstanding. But none of that happened. Instead, as the sheriff marched him down the street, a few soft voices rose from the crowd, all carrying the same quiet truth. "We should have seen it sooner. She never looked safe with him. That bruise wasn't from a fall." And with those murmurs came tiny shifts, people stepping closer to Marin instead of away, women offering her the shadow of their parasols, the blacksmith's wife gently brushing dirt from her shawl, a ranch hand muttering an apology under his breath without needing her to accept it. Harlan, hearing the change behind him, twisted violently in the sheriff's grip and spit toward the bystanders, shouting, "You're all fools! You let a savage trick you!" But even in his fury, he avoided the Apache's eyes, because he'd felt the silent weight of that man's gaze, the kind of unshakable truth-telling silence no liar could endure. The friction tightened as the sheriff reached the jailhouse steps and shoved Harlan inside with a force that snapped the last thread of the man's self-importance. "Assault," the sheriff said flatly. "Premarital harm, fraud, attempted coercion." Harlan sputtered. "Coercion? She owed me. I paid—" The sheriff slammed the cell door hard enough to cut him off. "No payment gives you a woman." And just like that, the truth had a home. The cell door clicked. The lies ended. The Apache finally turned his head, meeting Marin's eyes with a quiet that held no triumph, no claim, only the calm certainty of someone who'd done exactly what needed doing. Nothing more, nothing less. Marin felt her breath leave her chest in a soft, shaking rush as the last pieces of fear drifted away like dust kicked off a rooftop. Fade softened the scene as townsfolk slowly returned to their homes, each step heavier with reflection, while Marin stood alone on the jailhouse porch beside the Apache, realizing with a slow, blooming clarity that the blame she'd been carrying in silence was gone. Lifted not because he defended her loudly, but because he stood silently long enough for the truth to rise and hang over the town like a new kind of dawn. Dawn broke across Dry Creek with a gentleness the town hadn't felt in months. The early light spilling over rooftops and hitching posts like it meant to soften everything it touched, turning the dust in the air to gold instead of grit. Maren stood at the far end of the street with her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders, its familiar weight steadier now. Not something to hide behind, but something that belonged to her again. And for the first time, she let the quiet morning settle inside her without fear of who might take it away. Behind her, the sheriff locked the jailhouse door with a heavy final click. Harlan's muffled shouts already losing power as the town around him began to breathe like a place shaken awake from a long sleep. Townsfolk sweeping porches, opening shutters, stepping into the morning not to watch a spectacle, but to continue their lives. Lives that would no longer be shaped by the man whose cruelty had ruled their silence. The Apache stood a few paces from Maren, leaning beside the old well with his arms crossed loosely, his posture relaxed but attentive in a way that made it clear he wasn't guarding her, just making sure the road ahead wasn't emptied of choice by the weight of what she'd endured. He hadn't left after the arrest, hadn't followed the crowd, hadn't tried to speak for her or decide anything in her name. He'd simply stayed near enough that if the world tried to shrink around her again, it would have to pass through him first. She glanced his way, expecting him to look back immediately, but he wasn't watching her. He was watching the horizon. The slow awakening of a valley untouched by Harlan's shadow, a soft morning that held no demands. That alone steadied her breath. The friction came when Maren's uncle shuffled toward her from the general store, eyes lowered, guilt heavy in his shoulders, muttering, I didn't know what else to do." She swallowed, letting the words settle, the wound of betrayal still raw but no longer dictating her every breath. She didn't hate him, but she wasn't ready to excuse him either. "Then I'll decide what happens next," she said quietly, and her uncle nodded before retreating, leaving her with nothing but the open road and the soft scrape of the Apache's boots approaching. He stopped beside her. Not close, not far, just enough that she felt the warmth of another human presence without being overshadowed by it. "You choose your direction," he said, 4 words spoken in the same calm tone he'd used when he first stepped between her and a life she hadn't chosen. Maren looked down the long dirt road, its ruts softened by the rising sun, leading away from Dry Creek, away from the church steps, away from 10 coins and a forced vow. She didn't know where it ended, but for the first time, she didn't need to. "I'll go," she whispered, "but not alone." The Apache gave a slow nod, stepping aside so she could walk first, his presence falling in quietly behind her, not leading, not claiming, only letting the world see exactly one thing. She was walking by her own choice now, and he was simply ensuring nothing tried to take that from her again. Fade eased into the morning as Maren stepped into the open road, her shadow long and steady in the rising light. A woman once traded for 10 coins, now carrying her dignity into a dawn that finally belonged to her. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a woman being forced into a marriage for 10 coins, would you have stayed silent or stepped forward like the Apache did? Tell us in the comments.